A peaceful hike through the mountains took an unexpected turn when a lone traveler spotted a dog clinging to the edge of a cliff. With no time to hesitate, he risked his own safety to pull the animal to solid ground. But just when he thought the danger had passed, the dog did something that left him completely stunned. Logan had always been drawn to the raw beauty of nature, and the Colorado mountains had long been one of his favorite places to escape from the noise of the world. He had planned this trip for months, eager to spend a full week alone in the wilderness, away from distractions and responsibilities. His backpack was packed with all the essential stunts: food, water, survival gear, and a sturdy rope in case of emergencies. He knew the mountains could be unpredictable, but that was part of the adventure. As he made his way through the rugged terrain, the landscape stretched before him in breathtaking colors. The sky was a brilliant blue, unbroken by clouds, and the air smelled of pine and earth. Towering rock formations, some with deep red hues and jagged edges, framed his path. Every few miles he could hear the distant rush of water from hidden streams or waterfalls. The stillness of the wilderness was exactly what he had been craving. By the second day, Logan had covered significant ground, weaving through narrow trails and climbing over rocky slopes. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, he reached the edge of a steep canyon. He paused for a moment, taking in the sheer drop before him. The canyon walls stretched down to a winding river below, its waters rushing between jagged boulders. He was about to move forward when a faint sound caught his attention, something between a whimper and a cry. It was barely audible over the distant roar of the river, but it was enough to make him stop. Scanning the landscape, he stepped cautiously toward the edge, peering down to locate the source of the sound. His breath caught in his throat when he saw a golden retriever, its fur dusty and matted, clinging desperately to a narrow ledge just below him. The dog's legs trembled as it struggled to keep from slipping further down. Its body was tense, every muscle straining against gravity. Logan could see the fear in its wide eyes, its chest rising and falling rapidly with exhaustion. His instincts kicked in immediately. Without hesitation, he swung his backpack off his shoulders, pulling out his rope. He secured one end to the thick trunk of a nearby tree, testing its hold before throwing the other end down toward the dog. The retriever looked up, ears twitching, as if unsure of what to do. Logan lowered himself slightly, gripping a sturdy branch for balance.
"It's okay, buddy,"
he called out gently.
"I've got you."
The dog whimpered again, its paws slipping slightly. Logan's heart pounded. He knew he had to act fast. He tossed the rope closer, hoping the dog would understand. To his surprise, the retriever reacted, snapping its jaws around the rope. Its teeth clenched tightly as it fought to hold on. Logan wrapped the rope around his hands, bracing himself against the strain. The dog was heavier than he expected, and as he pulled, the rough fibers of the rope bit into his skin. His muscles burned as he gritted his teeth and heaved inch by inch, bringing the retriever closer to safety. The dog struggled, its hind legs kicking against the cliffside, but it didn't let go. Every pull felt like a battle against gravity, but Logan refused to give up. His boots dug into the rocky ground as he used every ounce of strength he had. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and his breath came in sharp gasps. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the retriever scrambled up over the edge, collapsing onto solid ground. Logan fell back, exhausted, watching as the dog panted heavily, its sides heaving. Its golden fur was streaked with dirt, its paws scraped from the ordeal. But most importantly, it was alive. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply sat there, side by side, catching their breath. Then, to Logan's surprise, the dog turned to him and licked his hand. It was a small gesture, but one filled with gratitude. Logan smiled, reaching out hesitantly to stroke its head. Its fur was rough and tangled, but warm beneath his fingers.
"You're a tough one,"
he murmured. The retriever wagged its tail weakly before standing, giving itself a vigorous shake. For a moment, it simply stared at Logan, as if committing its face to memory. Then, without a sound, it turned and trotted toward the trees. Logan watched as the dog disappeared into the wilderness, its golden coat blending with the dappled sunlight filtering through the branches. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. In all his years of hiking, he had never experienced anything quite like this. He had saved a lost dog from certain death, and just like that, it was gone. With a final glance toward the spot where the retriever had vanished, Logan stood up, dusted himself off, and continued on his journey, never expecting to see the dog again. Logan continued along the rugged trail, adjusting his backpack as he moved deeper into the wilderness. The encounter with the dog had been unexpected, but now that it was over, he pushed the thought aside. He had done what he could, and the dog had run off hopefully back to wherever it had come from. Still, the memory of its exhausted body clinging to the cliffside lingered in his mind. He had felt a strange connection in the brief moment when it licked his hand, but animals in the wild had their own instincts, their own survival. It was best to leave things as they were. As the sun began its slow descent, Logan trekked through a narrow mountain path, surrounded by towering pines and the occasional rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. The air was cool, crisp, and filled with the earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. He was focused on the trail ahead when a soft noise from behind made him pause. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the distant chirping of birds. It was the sound of light footsteps, careful and deliberate. Turning his head slightly, he caught a glimpse of movement among the trees. At first, he thought it might be a coyote or some other curious animal, but as he looked closer, he realized what it was. The golden retriever, the same one he had pulled from the cliff just hours ago. Logan stopped in his tracks and turned fully to face the dog. It froze as well, standing a short distance away watching him. Its ears were perked up, its eyes alert but cautious. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck.
You again?
He muttered. The dog didn't move. It simply stood there, tail low but wagging slightly, as if waiting for something. Logan took a step forward, and the dog instinctively backed up a few inches. It wasn't coming too close, but it wasn't leaving either.
You should go back.
Logan said, waving his hand as if to shoo it away.
Go on. Find your way home.
The dog didn't budge. It just blinked at him, head tilting slightly, as if it didn't understand her. Maybe it just didn't care. Logan shook his head and turned away, continuing on his path. He was certain the dog would eventually get bored and disappear into the forest. But as he walked, he kept hearing it. The soft patter of paws on dirt, the occasional shuffle of leaves. It was following him, always keeping a safe distance but never falling too far behind. At first, Logan ignored it, assuming the dog would eventually tire of this game. But as the hours passed and the sun dipped lower in the sky, it became clear that the retriever had no intention of leaving. Every time he turned around, it was there always a few steps back, watching, waiting. When he finally stopped to set up camp for the night near a gentle riverbank, the dog lingered at the edge of the clearing, still unwilling to leave. Logan worked in silence, pitching his tent and gathering wood for a small fire. Occasionally, he would glance toward the retriever, expecting it to be gone. But every time, it was still there, sitting patiently, watching him. As the fire crackled to life, Logan opened his pack and pulled out a small can of food. He hesitated for a moment before glancing at the dog. He asked the dog if it wanted to eat, although not expecting an answer. The retriever's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and when Logan placed a small portion of food a few feet away, it cautiously stepped forward. Sniffing the meal first, the dog finally began to eat, devouring the food as if it hadn't had a real meal in days. Logan watched, noting the dog's thin frame beneath its thick golden fur. It had clearly been alone for some time. Maybe it had wandered off from a campsite, or maybe it had been abandoned. Whatever the case, it was surviving on its own out here. Once the dog finished eating, it licked its lips and looked up at Logan, its eyes shining in the firelight. There was something intelligent about its gaze, something knowing. Logan sighed and leaned back, stretching out his legs.
I guess you earned that.
He said. The retriever took a few cautious steps forward, then curled up a short distance from the fire. It didn't try to come any closer, but it also didn't leave. Logan studied it for a moment, then shook his head with a small chuckle.
You're a stubborn one. I'll call you Buddy,
he said. The dog's tail thumped against the ground at the sound of the name, and for some reason, that made Logan smile. As the night deepened, the air grew colder. But Buddy remained curled near the fire, his breathing slow and steady. Logan lay back, staring at the stars above. He had set out on this journey expecting solitude, but now he had an unexpected companion. He wasn't sure how long the dog would stick around, maybe just for the night, or maybe longer. Either way, he didn't mind. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight crept through the trees, Logan stretched and sat up. He glanced toward the spot where Buddy had been sleeping, expecting him to be gone. But to his surprise, the retriever was still there, sitting alert, his tail wagging slightly, as if waiting for Logan to wake up. Logan exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head.
Guess you're not going anywhere, huh?
Buddy stood up, shaking out his fur and trotting closer. There was no hesitation now. The distance between them had disappeared. Logan packed up his gear, and when he started walking, Buddy followed this time without hesitation, without caution. The retriever trotted beside him, as if they had been traveling together all along. And just like that, Logan had a new hiking partner. Logan and Buddy quickly settled into a rhythm as they continued their journey through the mountains. During the day, they hiked side by side, Logan navigating the rough terrain while Buddy trotted ahead, sniffing the air, his ears always alert. At night, they camped together near rivers or under clusters of towering pine trees, sharing warmth beside the flickering glow of a small fire. Though Logan had spent years hiking alone, accustomed to the solitude and quiet of the wilderness, he found that Buddy's presence didn't disrupt the peace he loved. Instead, it enhanced it. There was something comforting about having another living being by his side, something grounding about the soft sound of paws padding against the dirt and the occasional wag of a golden tail. Buddy wasn't just a companion, he was useful too. More than once, he veered off the trail to investigate something with his sharp nose, leading Logan towards safer paths when the terrain became unstable. His keen senses warned of small animals rustling in the underbrush, giving Logan time to prepare rather than be startled. When the wind howled through the trees at night, Buddy remained alert, his ears flicking at the slightest noise. Logan had always relied on his own instincts, but now he had Buddy's too. At first, he resisted the idea of depending on the dog. He had spent years exploring the wilderness alone, trusting only his own skills to survive. But, as the days passed, he found himself appreciating Buddy's presence more and more. There was something deeply reassuring about knowing that even in the vast emptiness of the mountains, he wasn't completely alone. As they climbed to higher elevations, the landscape changed. The air grew thinner, sharper. The trees became sparser, their branches bending against the cold wind that swept through the peaks. Logan pulled his jacket tighter around himself, watching as Buddy trotted ahead, his fur ruffling in the icy breeze. The warmth of the previous days had vanished, replaced by a creeping chill that signaled an incoming storm. Dark clouds gathered in the distance, heavy and foreboding, swallowing the sun in thick layers of grey. Logan knew he had to find shelter before the storm arrived. He glanced down at Buddy, who had also noticed the shift in the air. The dog's ears flattened, his nose twitching as he sniffed the wind. Then, without warning, Buddy suddenly stopped, his body stiffening. He let out a short, sharp bark, then turned his head toward a cluster of rocks ahead. Logan hesitated, following Buddy's gaze. The terrain was rocky, uneven, but something about the way Buddy stood completely still, focused, made it clear that the dog had sensed something. Trusting Buddy's instincts, Logan stepped forward. Without warning, Buddy took off in a sprint, weaving between the rocks with effortless agility. Logan followed, his boots crunching against loose gravel as he climbed. After a few minutes, Buddy stopped in front of a dark opening in the mountainside deer cave. partially hidden by jagged boulders and overgrown shrubs. Logan's breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward cautiously, peering inside. The entrance was just wide enough for him to crawl through. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized it opened up into a small, dry chamber. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to keep them out of the wind and away from the worst of the storm. Buddy wagged his tail, clearly pleased with himself, and Logan couldn't deny the dog's sharp instincts had just saved them from a rough night. They wasted no time setting up a small space inside. Logan unrolled his sleeping bag and placed his pack against the rock wall. Buddy curled up beside him, his body warm against Logan's leg. Outside, the wind howled, and moments later, the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, the storm was in full force, rain hammering against the rocks, thunder rumbling through the sky like a distant drum. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cave for a split second before plunging it back into darkness. Logan watched the storm rage outside, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Without Buddy, he would have been stuck out there, exposed to the elements with nowhere to hide. He leaned back against the cave wall, stretching his legs as Buddy shifted beside him, letting out a deep sigh. For the first time in a long time, Logan didn't feel entirely alone. He had always thought of solitude as something necessary, something sought out. But now, as he listened to the steady sound of Buddy's breathing beside him, he realized that maybe he hadn't been looking for isolation. Maybe he had been looking for something else all along. He reached down, running his fingers through Buddy's thick fur. The dog made a soft noise, content, and pressed closer. Logan exhaled, a slow, thoughtful breath, and let his head rest against the cave wall. The storm continued outside, but inside, with Buddy at his side, he felt safe. 3 days had passed since Logan and Buddy had found shelter in the cave. The storm had eventually cleared, leaving behind a sky so brilliantly blue it was hard to believe the same mountains had been cloaked in darkness just nights before. The air was fresher now, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine, and the warmth of the sun filtered through the treetops, casting shifting patterns of light along the forest floor. Logan felt at ease in a way he hadn't in years. The days of traveling with Buddy had given him a renewed sense of purpose. It was strange he'd always believed that solitude was what he sought in nature, but now he couldn't imagine walking these trails without the rhythmic sound of Buddy's paws beside him. The dog had become more than just a stray he had rescued. He was a part of this journey now, a companion in the vastness of the wilderness. As the afternoon stretched on, Logan and Buddy made their way down to a shallow stream nestled between tall fir trees. The water was clear, reflecting the shifting hues of the sky. The soft gurgle of the stream filled the silence, blending with the occasional rustling of leaves. It was a perfect place to rest for the evening. Logan shrugged off his pack and stretched, rolling his shoulders as he took in the tranquil surroundings. He knelt by the water's edge, cupping his hands to take a drink. The cold liquid was refreshing, cooling him from the inside out. Behind him, Buddy paced along the bank, his nose low to the ground, sniffing the damp soil. Logan smiled at the sight. The dog had adapted well to the wild, and though his body still bore signs of past hardship thin from days of hunger, fur marked with small scars was thriving now. Logan leaned back on his elbows, letting the sun warm his face as he watched Buddy explore. The retriever wandered a few feet away, tail raised slightly, ears flicking, as if listening for something just out of reach. That was when Logan noticed the subtle shift in Buddy's body language. The way his muscles tensed, his fur bristling. Logan sat up, suddenly alert.
Buddy?
The dog didn't respond. He stood frozen, his amber eyes locked onto something ahead. Then, without warning, a deep growl rumbled from his chest. Logan's heart stuttered. He followed Buddy's gaze to a pile of sun-warmed rocks a few feet away. His breath caught in his throat. Coiled in the dappled sunlight, barely visible against the earth, was a rattlesnake. The thick-bodied serpent lay still at first, blending in seamlessly with the rocks. Its patterned skin was the color of sand and stone, nearly indistinguishable from its surroundings. But then, as if sensing their presence, it lifted its triangular head, its dark, lidless eyes fixing on them. Logan barely had time to react before the snake moved. The dry, unmistakable sound of a rattle filled the air, a warning, sharp and deliberate. Instinct kicked in. He took a slow step back, raising his hands slightly.
Easy now.
He muttered, mostly to himself. He knew better than to make any sudden movements. He had encountered snakes before, and most of the time they only struck if provoked. But Buddy didn't understand that. The retriever's growl deepened, his stance low and rigid, ready to spring. Logan could see the tension in his body, the sheer focus in his gaze. Buddy wasn't afraid, he was preparing to fight.
Buddy, stay.
Logan ordered, his voice firm but calm. If he could just get the dog to hold back, they could slowly retreat. The snake struck. It happened in a blur of movement, too fast for Logan to react. The rattlesnake lunged, its sleek body propelling forward with terrifying precision, fangs bared, aiming directly for Logan's leg. But Buddy moved faster. The retriever lunged in front of Logan at the last possible second, intercepting the attack. Teeth flashed, fur bristled, and in the space of a heartbeat, the two animals collided. Buddy snarled as he snapped at the snake, twisting his body out of reach of its fangs. Logan's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The scene before him was almost too surreal to process. Buddy dodged another strike, dancing just out of range before lunging again, his jaws snapping dangerously close to the serpent's thick body. The snake recoiled, its rattle shaking furiously. It struck again, but Buddy was relentless. He barked sharply, lunging forward to feint an attack, forcing the snake to recoil even further. Logan knew he had to act fast. He scanned the ground, his mind racing. A large branch lay a few feet away. He grabbed it without hesitation, gripping the rough bark as he turned back to the fight unfolding before him. Buddy was holding the snake's attention, keeping it fixated on him rather than Logan. The rattlesnake was coiled now, its body shifting in shape, poised for another attack. Logan didn't give it the chance. With a forceful swing, he brought the branch down between the snake and Buddy, slamming it against the dirt. The impact startled the rattlesnake, making it hesitate. Its rattle buzzed loudly in protest, but Logan took another step forward, raising the stick again. This time, he jabbed it toward the snake's body, forcing it to retreat further. The rattlesnake hissed, body undulating as it began to back away toward the rocks. It lingered for a moment, its head still raised, tongue flicking. Then, with one last flick of its tail, it disappeared into the underbrush, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Silence settled over the clearing. Logan let out a shaky breath, his pulse still hammering in his ears. He turned immediately to Buddy, scanning him for any signs of injury. The retriever was panting, his sides rising and falling rapidly, but he seemed unharmed. Logan ran a hand over Buddy's fur, checking his legs, his muzzle no bite marks, no blood. The relief that washed over him was overwhelming.
You crazy dog,
he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt beside Buddy, gripping the sides of his face gently. The retriever licked his chin in response, tail wagging weakly. Logan let out a short laugh, though it was more from nerves than amusement. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his hand.
You saved my life,
he murmured. Buddy just wagged his tail harder, as if none of it had been a big deal, as if he hadn't just thrown himself in front of a venomous snake to protect Logan without a second thought. Logan sat back, running a hand through his hair. He had saved Buddy once, pulling him from the edge of that cliff, and now Buddy had done the same for him. It was a strange, unspoken balance one that left Logan feeling more connected to this dog than he had to another living thing in a long time. Looking down at Buddy, Logan knew without a doubt that he wasn't just some stray that had wandered into his life. He was something more, a companion, a protector, a friend. For the first time since the journey began, Logan no longer saw himself as just a lone traveler in the wilderness. He had a partner now, one he hadn't expected, but one he could no longer imagine being without. Logan reached out, ruffling Buddy's fur.
Guess you're stuck with me now, huh?
Buddy let out a small huff before flopping down beside Logan, his body pressed against his leg. Logan smiled softly, letting his hand rest on the dog's back. He had started this trip alone, but now, he realized, he would never be alone again. The morning air was crisp as Logan stirred from his makeshift bed near the dying embers of the fire. Buddy was curled up beside him, his golden fur ruffled slightly by the wind. The previous day's encounter with the rattlesnake still weighed heavily on Logan's mind. He had faced danger before in the wilderness, but never with another life depending on him, and never with one so willing to risk itself for him in return. He ran a hand through Buddy's fur, feeling the warmth of the dog's body. The bond they had formed in such a short time was undeniable, and Logan knew he couldn't ignore it. With a deep breath, he sat up and stretched, gazing out at the vast expanse of the Colorado wilderness. He had planned for a longer journey, but now things were different. The mountains would always be here waiting for him, but he couldn't put Budyor himself through another dangerous encounter. It was time to go home. Packing up camp was a familiar routine, but this time it felt different. There was no longer the silence of solitude. Instead, there was the soft padding of paws, the occasional wagging tail brushing against him, the quiet presence of a companion who had become part of his world. Buddy watched him closely, ears perked, as if sensing the shift in plans. Logan slung his backpack over his shoulders and gave the dog a reassuring pat.
Come on, buddy. Let's get out of here,
he said. The journey back down the mountain was slower than Logan had anticipated, partly because he kept pausing to take in the scenery one last time, and partly because Buddy would occasionally stop to sniff at something or chase a butterfly through the grass. Unlike before, the dog no longer followed from a distance. He trotted beside Logan without hesitation, his trust in the man now complete. Logan hadn't realized how much he had grown used to Buddy's presence until he imagined walking this trail alone again. The thought felt strangely hollow. The past few days had changed something deep within him, something he hadn't expected when he first set off into the mountains. He had come out here in search of solitude, but he had found something far more meaningful. By midday, the dirt trails widened into a gravel road, and the first signs of civilization appeared a wooden sign pointing towards a small roadside cafe, a place he had passed on his way into the wilderness. Logan hadn't planned on stopping, but his legs were aching from the descent, and the thought of real food, something other than dried rations, was too tempting to ignore. He pushed open the door, the scent of coffee and fresh-baked bread greeting him instantly. A few locals sat at wooden tables, sipping their drinks, engaged in quiet conversation. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, and a few heads turned toward him. The sight of Buddy padding in behind him earned a few raised eyebrows, but no one said anything. Logan found a seat near the window and ordered a cup of coffee. As he waited, an older man seated at the counter glanced at him, his gaze lingering on Buddy. There was something knowing in the man's expression, a recognition of sorts. Logan reached down to scratch Buddy behind the ears, feeling the warmth of the dog's presence beside him. The man's interest didn't wane, and soon Logan found himself recounting everything the moment he found Buddy clinging to the edge of the cliff, the way the dog had followed him despite his protests. And finally, the moment Buddy had leaped in front of the rattlesnake to save his life. As he spoke, others in the cafe turned to listen. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to amazement, and a quiet murmur of disbelief spread through the small space. It wasn't every day that someone heard about a stray dog forming such an unbreakable bond with a traveler, let alone risking its own life in an act of loyalty. Some nodded in silent understanding, while others exchanged glances, as if realizing they had just witnessed something rare. Among them, the old man at the counter sipped his coffee thoughtfully. He seemed unsurprised, as though he had heard of such things before. There was an old belief, he explained, that dogs appearing in the wilderness weren't just lost souls looking for a home. Some saw them as a kind of blessing, a guardian sent by nature itself. Logan listened, the words settling deep within him. He had never thought much about fate or meaning in such a way, but looking down at Buddy, he couldn't deny that something about their meeting had felt like it was always meant to be. The decision had already been made in his heart long before he left the cafe. Buddy wasn't just some stray who had crossed his path. He was family now. As Logan stood, he exchanged a few final words with the locals before stepping back outside, the crisp mountain air hitting his face. The weight he had carried on his shoulders before this trip, the quiet loneliness he had once embraced, felt lighter now. Before heading home, Logan made one last stop at a small veterinary clinic just outside of town. The vet, a kind woman with gentle hands, examined Buddy thoroughly, noting that he was underweight but otherwise in good health. The signs of a dog that had been alone for too long were there, but nothing that good food and care wouldn't fix. Logan felt a pang of guilt at the thought of what Buddy must have endured before they met, but it was quickly replaced by the certainty that he would never have to face such hardship again. Once Buddy had received a clean bill of health and a much-needed meal, they finally started the drive home. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, his nose pressed to the window, watching the world pass by with quiet fascination. Every so often, Logan reached over to scratch behind his ears, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle over him. By the time they arrived at Logan's cabin, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting warm orange and purple hues over the mountains in the distance. He pushed the door open and half expected Buddy to hesitate, to show some sign that he longed for the wilderness. But the retriever simply trotted inside as if he had always belonged there, his tail wagging as he explored his new home. Logan set his pack down and watched as Buddy jumped onto the couch, circling once before settling in. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment all along, as if this was the home he had been searching for. A quiet chuckle escaped Logan as he ran a hand through his hair. Everything about this trip had taken a turn he never expected, but somehow it all made perfect sense. That night, Logan sat on his porch, looking out at the distant outline of the Colorado mountains. The stars stretched endlessly above him, twinkling in the deep blue sky. He had set out on this journey searching for solitude, for a break from the world. Instead, he had found something much greater. He reached down, running a hand through Buddy's fur as the dog lay beside him, his breathing slow and steady. The memories of the past few days replayed in his mind: the cliff, the hikes, the storm, the snake. He had saved Buddy once, and in return, Buddy had saved him right back. As the wind rustled through the trees, Buddy let out a soft sigh, as if he understood the unspoken words between them. Logan smiled, knowing that from now on, neither of them would ever have to face the world alone again.